Hi, everyone. Welcome to our discussion forum based on our Delta Think News and Views series. For the regulars, welcome back. We're very happy to see you again. And for the newbies, we're thrilled to have you join us today, and we hope that you will join us again in the future. First, I'm going to start with a few quick introductions. I'm Heather Staines, Senior Strategy Consultant here at Delta Think and Director of Community Engagement for the Open Access Data and Analytics Tool. With me is my colleague and News and Views authors, Dan Pollock, our Chief Digital Officer, I can't speak today, at Delta Think, and architect of the Delta Think Open Access Data and Analytics Tool. We are also honored to have a special guest join today, Ann Michael. Ann is Chief Transformation Officer at AIP Publishing and an architect of the OADAT. You may recall that Ann co-authored the September News and Views along with Dan on the OSTP Memo. Welcome, Dan and Ann. Now, if you've joined us for these News and Views forums before, you know we designed these to be very interactive with lots of questions and participation from you. So we hope that you're prepared for a lively and informal discussion. A few logistics before we start. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A box. Unfortunately, as I mentioned prior, somehow the chat has become disabled. That is not my intention. I don't think trying to fix it at the last minute will probably bode well. So we'll do the best that we can with the Q&A for today. Feel free to just put your comments in there as well. Now, as far as structure, we're going to have some opening remarks to kick us off, and then we'll move into the questions and open discussion after that. And we have scheduled an hour for this today, and we do have a lot to cover, but if we finish early, we are happy to send you on your way earlier. So thanks again for joining us, and I will now hand off to Dan to get started, and I'm going to stop sharing so we can see Dan. There we go.
Thank you, Heather, and hello, everyone. Great of you to join us. So I'll kick off with the first bit and just have a quick recap of the headlines of our market sizing exercise. Just a quick reminder for those of you who may be unfamiliar with it. Each year, we try and estimate the size of the open access journals market. I think we're into about our 7th year of doing this now. And to do that, we take in a bunch of information about the output, the numbers of papers being published across all models and actual facts are open access and not open access. And we also run an annual survey of publishers. That second thing, the survey is confidential, so we do not share individual publishers' data points about their revenues. But what we can do is we aggregate that up, and that information helps us project up and estimate a total market size. So enough on the method for now. I guess we may get back into that. But the headlines are that we estimate that in 2021, the open access market grew to around $1.6 billion US. And that was a pretty big increase, 32% increase over 2020. And that, of course, is significantly larger than the growth in the overall scholarly journals market, which is typically mid to low single-digit percent. We think that there's been a sort of underlying shift in the underlying trends in growth, and that we've really seen an acceleration in growth in open access over the last 2 or 3 years or so, driven by a number of factors, which I'm sure we'll get into. But if current trends continue, we think the market should be worth well in excess of $2 billion US by the end of 2024. So pretty big numbers now coming through. And then just to put this in some sort of context in terms of market share, we think there's around about 45% of papers published are now published open access in some form. So the volume accounts for about 45% share of the market, but the value, that revenue number, is about 15% of the total journals market. So the money, if you like, lags the activity. And again, we can get into that. And then a couple of other things. We've seen a real boost in growth in all scholarly output, and especially in open access over the last couple of years, particularly COVID-19. It has led to a spike in submissions, and I think many publishers have witnessed that. But of course, everything that comes up must eventually regress to the mean, as the data analysts say. And so we're getting mixed anecdotal feedback about 2022. I think that some publishers are saying they're seeing a fallback in activity to maybe 2019 levels, but others have said to us they are expecting growth in 2022, albeit not quite at the same spectacular levels that they've perhaps seen over the last couple of years. So we expect things to fall back somewhat in 2022. So if you like, the chart will flatten out a little bit. And the underlying compound annualized growth rates, CAGRs, we think there's a 3-year CAGR, 2021 through 2024, of around about 12-13% in both volume and value. So we've got a big growth and then a bit dip and then sort of back to levels again. So that's the headlines. $1.6 billion market. Big growth numbers, on target, we think, for about $2 billion in 2024, and then that difference between share of volume and share of value. So I think I'm going to stop there. That's the market sizing. And then we also wanted to get into some of the OSTP, recent updated OSTP memo. So Anne, can I hand over to you, please, for that?
Sure, and I apologize to everyone in advance. I'm getting over being sick. It wasn't COVID. I keep forgetting there are other things out there. So if my voice is a little odd, if I have to cough, I apologize in advance. So Dan and I did do an update on OSTP and some analysis a couple months ago. And just as a backup to that, or as an introduction, some of the things that were not in that plan, but to put everybody on the same page, is that, just in summary, what did the memo really ask for? It was interesting that the language was quite soft in a lot of places. And I believe that's mostly to give all of the different agencies a little latitude in how they implemented the guidelines. But the guidelines include zero embargo on the AAM or the version of record or the VOR, basically on peer-reviewed content. Research data now is in scope as well. Additional metadata requirements were introduced. Content needed to be machine readable. And unlike the previous memo in the past, this one applied to all U.S. agencies funding research, which the previous memo had excluded funders, U.S. agency funders of under $100 million in research. But there were a lot of things that were not specified. And the reason I bring this up before getting into this analysis is some of these things could very well impact how the data shows up when these papers that are, when we go through the process and these papers that are covered by these guidelines start to show up, in the research ecosystem. So first of all, there was no license type specified. And historically, US public access has not included a license type requirement. So that is interesting to note. It does not mean that agencies that implement the guidelines can't choose to introduce a license type requirement, but the guidelines themselves don't include that. There's no rights retention requirement. So everybody remember when Plan S introduced that, there is no need for the author to retain the rights to their work. There's a question mark about funding availability. So there's some language in there that talks about, well, if the grants funded APCs, it would amount to, I think it was 0.5% or something of funding, but there wasn't a commitment that they would, and there wasn't a statement that they would not. And there was no business model specified. Now it does lean heavily, language leans heavily towards an APC environment. And that's just because I believe APC is just a prevalent model of the day. Doesn't mean it will be the prevalent model tomorrow, but it is of today. But what's interesting about that, so unlike Plan S, which said you can't publish in hybrid journals, and then ultimately, unless they were part of transformative agreements or they were transformative journals themselves, the OSTP guidelines does not say anything about where you can publish. It just says the aforementioned points. So Dan and I were looking at this, and as DeltaThink usually does, DeltaThink looks at things from the whole market perspective. So it's an average across the globe. And I say that because your mileage may vary. Looking at the entire global output and basing it on some estimates that were done in other places, we went with a 7.9% of global output being from the US, and also noted that that is declining, that's what it is right now. And then we did some projections, ranging that would go out to 100% compliance from starting from about 18 months after the policy goes into effect, which is January of 2026. So if you look at the impact of those charts, the impact is probably a lot more modest than some folks would expect. And we can get into the numbers shortly, but my point, the point that I would want to make is that for US-based societies in particular, and speaking from one, that average doesn't necessarily represent our portfolios. I'm not only at the AIP publishing, but I'm also on the publication committees for the American Society for Microbiology, the American Heart Association, and on the advisory board for Johns Hopkins University Press. And also constantly talking to many, many other societies. And what I'm hearing from a lot of these US societies is something on the par of 30 to 50% of their content is funded by US agencies. So needless to say, it's something that's making them stand up and take note. Now, we're never in the business of fear mongering. So I'm not saying, you should run around with your hair on fire and immediately try to think of how to immediately flip your entire portfolio to open access. But by the same token, I would caution people not to let the exclusion of hybrid or license type or any of these other items, or even the fact that we were talking about, the Congressional Oversight Committee asking for more information. I wouldn't want that to lull anybody into a false sense of complacency either. So I think I just want to end up, and Dan, we can go into some of the numbers. The scenario that was interesting to me, there were several scenarios that we played out. One scenario in the article was that OST policy affects around 30% of publishers' output. And that in that scenario, the higher proportion of affected papers led to, and again, this is from a publisher side, a revenue reduction of around 9%. And that was actually surprising to me. I thought it would be more, but it wasn't when we modeled out, given the options that were included. So the one thing we also wanted to cover on is that while the OSTP memo and our concern often is around journals, we thought it would be nice for Heather to tell us a little bit about how this might impact the book side of publishing.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. I think, I'm a book person myself, and come from that space. And I've been having a lot of conversations with both with STM publishers that have robust book programs, but also with university presses. And, everyone wishes we had more clarity now at this point, as some of you who are researchers yourselves know, or those who work with researchers, books do tend to play out over a longer period of time. They tend to have multiple sources of funding. How you allocate that towards which research projects you're working on can vary dramatically. There has been, some, probably a lot more conversation in the UK happening because books were added to the recent REF requirements. So with a variety of different OA models, I would look to some of our publishers and colleagues in the UK to see how their anticipation is kind of playing out as far as that goes. I think we're going to be keeping a close eye out for opportunities for consultation and for collaboration. And as Anne said, it's going to be a little while before the grants that are applied to actual research come into play. And I think we'll see that, even be further out with books. But, we really would love to get feedback from anyone on this call for questions specific to books.
Heather, I just wanted
Okay.
to add something too, like what I did not go into at all, and forgive my like illness-addled brain, was anything about the timeline. So I think that's actually a critical point. So there's a lot, I mentioned that there's variation, but the way that it was put forward is that agencies now have agencies over $100 million, because they were subject to the previous memo, have 180 days to respond with their policies, and they would go through some type of a vetting process. And then the agencies that were lower than that, $100 million, they have twice as much time to respond. But in essence, the entire policy for each agency is supposed to be in place by December 31st of 2025. So that's where we're getting January of 2026. And then the other thing to note is, it's hearsay, but it's interesting. It's been coming up in a lot of circles with people that lobby the US government and work with these agencies, is a lot of people suspect that the first larger agencies like the NIH, for example, that come out with their plan, that other agencies are just going to do what they do. So
Yeah.
it'll be interesting to watch that.
Yeah. Dan?
And then just so, Anne, you mentioned the numbers that 30% of your publications are US funded, with a drop of 9% or so in revenues. The reason that's a bit lower is because of one of the assumptions we made in the model. So, you mentioned that everybody's situation is different. When we try to estimate the effects on this, you've got to say, well, okay, if what happens to those, that 30%, say, that are moved outside the paywall, that are made public access under some mechanism. And the scenario we model is that the publishers would be able to charge for them. So it basically move to, quote, gold open access or paid for open access. So what you find is you're losing ground on possible lost subscription revenues. For example, you might have to lower your subs prices. You gain a little bit more back because you can charge for the publication process. And in general, back to our sizing, when we say that publication output has got a higher share of than publication value under open access, basically you make less money per article under an open access model on average. And so that's where you see you kind of lose 30% and gain 20 and sort of arrive at 9% or so. But of course, an individual publisher or society's situation may vary. It depends how much you can charge, in terms of what proportion you might charge for, and it might depend whether you can charge for it at all. So of course, things could be, you might lose more revenue than that if you, for whatever reason, can't charge for things, or you might lose less revenue than that if let's suppose the author accepted manuscript is fine and that doesn't really lead to any impact or softening of subscriptions. And of course, that's in some ways the fascinating, perhaps also scary thing about this stuff is we don't really know. We're a little bit short of detail, and everybody's situation is slightly different. So the idea of us putting these general figures out is to say to people, look, in general, you can produce a model for this, and here's a couple of typical results, just assuming an industry-wide average, and then one particular data point. But essentially, get in touch if you want to get into more detail. And ultimately, we think an important action for people is run your own custom analyses, and then you can figure out, okay, what does this mean for you? And I think, as Anne said, there's no reason to be complacent, but I don't think, or nor should we be panicking. That's where data is handy. It can help us get some clarity.
We do have a question from Eric at Iowa State. Is there a good place to see U.S. funding agencies and their yearly output? For example, if you just wanted to see the ones below the 100 million funding threshold that would now be covered. I don't know specifically of a place, but have you guys seen?
No, I was about to say that's a sort of classic desk research problem. I think you'd have to go around the various websites and then either A, hope that the various government and agency websites publish these things, which they might not necessarily do. There might be something in the National Science and Engineering Indicators report, which is a big biannual report put out by the National Science Foundation. I don't know how many other agencies it would pull in. And then finally, there's the kind of the usual indexes and sources to tap into. But the short answer is no. Exactly, Heather. No, we're not in touch. There's not one place that we know of. If anybody does know of a place, please drop us a note. I'm sure it would be very, very useful for everybody to tap into.
Great. I really want to talk about the big picture, we have two, large topic areas to talk about today: the market size and those changes, as well as the potential impact of OSTP. I want to talk about how the different forces, play off of each other in the big picture. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Well, I mean, I'll go first. I mentioned we've seen a big numbers and COVID-19. We think there's probably a number of factors that are feeding in to more and more activity in open access. So in general, publishers are looking at it more. I mean, back in 2014 through 2016, a lot of journals gained hybrid options. And then COVID-19 gave some boosters, and then the OSTP, the effects of the OSTP memo, wherever it lands, I think may act to add more growth. And then finally, things like Coalition S, Plan S, have caused publishers to look into open access more. So I think in general, there's a number of different things that are causing people to say, perhaps we need to increase our open access activity. I mean, and from the society perspective, particularly, what's your take? Are those the sort of factors that you?
Well, I think you're right, Dan. And I've been thinking about this a lot too, and not necessarily only from a society perspective. So I think what happened is we saw a spike. We saw it with COVID, and we went, "Oh wow, that's odd." And so what you try to do is you don't want to overstate something or assume that that's part of the new normal. And I think what's interesting now is now we have multiple data points, and like I say ad nauseum, it takes at least 3 points to make a line, and so or to see a direction, I should say, to make a trend. And now I think one thing that's clear is, even though some of the societies, I think, are experiencing different levels of submission, perhaps back to the 2019 level, some of the commercials and other societies are not. And so I think it's fair to say now, well, COVID-19 was a shot, but it isn't, no pun intended, but it wasn't necessarily something that was going to go back to zero. It has now changed the position of the curve. And I think what you were saying before, the fact that the rate of change is now going to start to approach back to average, it's doing that off of now a larger base. So like personally, I was really surprised by how big the number was. We were waiting for a billion, waiting for a billion, and then boom, went right past it. And that's why. And of course, there's the normal data lag in sources too that we have to deal with. It takes 24 months to get all the sources really to fully represent the year. 2 years ago.
And I think it's worth noting, and this is common practice amongst analysts. I've seen it in a number of reports from different sources. We do restate data points. As Anne's absolutely right. You've got to wait those 2 or 3 years before you could see where the line is on the chart. We previously didn't want to overstate the effect of COVID when you've only seen 1 year of it. Could it be a blip, then a drop and back to normal, which is what we saw in quite a few GDP figures. But exactly right, a year or so onwards, and with some forward-looking suggestions from anecdotal feedback and in our surveys, like, okay, now it looks like there's 3 or 4 data points that are above average. We can now kind of go back and put more aggressive assumptions into our models.
Right.
That's, I think, the best you can do as an analyst, particularly as we're trying to look at underlying trends, because we find if you take spot readings in this stuff, the lines tend to zigzag. You'll have growth coming in fits and starts, and we've always tried to avoid the hyperbole and say, oh, there's a big acceleration in open access 1 year, and it's fallen off another year, it's picked up again. I don't think that really helps people make sort of long-term decisions. So we try and look for that underlying curve or trend in the chart, so you can say, well, on the whole, growth is slowing down or accelerating, and again, once we had 2 or 3 years data lined up, we could see a tilt in the sort of the underlying growth curve.
So, and I think that the thing that I would like to say then as a society is, if anyone out there was unclear or unconvinced that increases in open access are the direction that we are more solidly heading in, it's really become undisputable or indisputable. I mean, there's just no disputing it. And so the question is, where do you want to be in that? Do you want to be, it's the classic adoption curve, right? I don't think anybody wants to be a laggard, and late majority has its issues. But as a publisher now, and especially as a society publisher, the competition is fierce. Scale is on the side of the commercials, and the question is, if this is continuing, and it is, where do you want to be in that? How do you want to differentiate yourself? How do you want to stand out from the crowd? Can you stand out from the crowd? And I think those are the kinds of questions that, we're asking ourselves, and other societies are asking themselves as well. And societies founded in the idea of membership, which is basically community, and my society is not a membership society, but it's a federation of membership societies. But the point is, it seems like there's going to be a lot of community types of activities that are going to keep spurring, because it is one of the unique values that societies believe that they bring to the table, and that they might be able to leverage. So it's interesting to see how this all fits together.
Yeah, and we have another question in the chat from Ian, and this is to start with Dan. Do your OA revenue numbers account for APCs only, or are you allocating revenue generated from transformative agreements in that sizing? I know this is a popular point of discussion internally that we have.
Yes, absolutely. I won't bore everyone to death with methodological detail. Short answer is yes, we do. So we frame things as anything that's arising from open access activity, classic APC models, but that could be sponsorship, or it could be the published portion of the read and publish sort of deals. Now, one of the balancing acts we have to strike is that different publishers will define these things differently. And then there's other revenues that may not depend on a paywall. So something like advertising revenue or sponsorship in general. Some organizations may, for example, have a dedicated sponsorship team that will sell supplements and sponsor journals. They'll have their own line in the P&L. And when somebody else then comes to say to us, well, we think roughly X% of our activity is down to open access, they may quite legitimately and understandably not include a slice of that, say, centralized sponsorship line, for example. What we're anticipating will happen is that as increasing proportions of publishers' activities and or revenues are due to open access, particularly the APC model, they may start to take a step back and say, well, perhaps we need to reallocate or reapportion revenues to reflect that. So we have a balancing act of trying to unpick things as much as possible, but also we need to reflect how publishers see themselves and how the market is defined in general. So yes, we try and get those other bits, but we probably expect that maybe more and more might start to move across the allocation thing. The metaphor I use here is if you're any big platform that might, for example, combine journals and books, or I don't know, conference proceedings and peer-reviewed articles, all comes together on a big platform that a publisher might put out there. How do you then decide what proportion of that platform's activity is down to the different moving parts? And that's a matter of your own choice. Do you do it on page views? Do you do it on revenue? Do you do it on journal numbers? There's a number of ways of splitting up these joint revenues. So we continue to have these internal discussions about and definition and try to get what we think is a reasonable representative subset. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's tough to think back just a few years ago. I think Anne and I were both at the Academic Publishing Europe meeting when the big Wiley project deal was announced, and everyone was kind of wondering what was going to happen. And I think that a lot of the language that we have now, transformative journals, transitional agreements, did not exist, at that time. And so I suspect that we will also see new models, some of which I've already been talking to some publishers and societies about, as well as new language come into play. And we're not quite there yet. I want to talk maybe a little bit about the effect that this quickly moving space might have on libraries. And I know that we've got quite a number of librarians joining us here today. Anecdotally, some folks that I know who work for consortia and the like have kind of indicated that negotiation is slowing, or maybe even stalled around transformative agreements now that, this rock uncertainty, though it may bring of OSTP, is kind of thrown into the water. What might, if you can kind of wax poetically a little bit, more movement towards transformative journals, less? It's kind of unfair to kind of just throw this at you out of the blue, but any speculation or prediction on, what we might see happen in that side of the thing?
It's a bit transformative journals or agreements in general.
Both.
Both, I would say.
Yeah.
I mean, I would throw out the big thing about transformative agreements and transformative journals are read and publish and read. All of that is that how fast does it change how the content of a journal towards open access, and how fast does that requirement cause a library to say, wait a second, and this is a number that we've been banting around for ages, and I don't know if someone has actual data on this. I would love to see it. But is it at 40% that librarian eyebrows raise? Is it at, at 70% that the pitchforks and the torches come out? And I mean that in a positive way.
Yeah.
I mean, they rightfully should come out.
So this is at what threshold would subscriptions collapse and librarians say, right, there's no point in paying for it.
Exactly. At what point? And historically, the uptake of hybrid, and again, your mileage varies. Some journals have gone to 75% hybrid and flipped and things that, but historically, it's been quite low. And so I think one interesting unintended consequence that might be a benefit to libraries and researchers from an access perspective is that if OSTP, if these organizations follow through, and even if they don't say, if they don't say you can't publish in a hybrid, but they simply have license requirements and obviously zero embargo requirements, do they make these journals hit those thresholds faster? So even without saying no transformative, do they actually start transforming?
Yeah. And also, do they, because another aspect of these mixed model deals is the move to sort of negotiating one price for all of the publishing services, whether they're the read or the publish side of things. So of course, then there's the point about scale, and that tends to work for the larger publishers and or institutions buying stuff. But of course, if you're caught in the middle of this, and that, for example, a US funding agency may cover publication costs, why would you then, as a consortium or a library, actually want to get involved in these negotiations and cover the total cost of publishing? That Uncle Sam's going to pick up a chunk of it. Subscriptions might soften, so that that may start to unpick some of these joint deals and act as a kind of counterforce against them. But meanwhile, I think there is something to be said for the all-in-one total cost of publishing, because it's one number, it's easy to administrate, and it acknowledges that publishing has a cost. Wherever we put the toll booths, peer review is vital. We've somehow got to pay for it. So I think there's going to be some conflicting forces at work.
Yeah, one of the spaces that I've been keeping a close eye on is the repository space. I mean, we talk in the market sizing exercise about paid open access, and open access that has a cost, but there's also, of course, significant efforts being put into place around green. And while the US isn't, kind of cohesive as one consortium, we do see quite extensive archiving and repositories in other parts of the world. And so to what degree is that process going to be affected by more and more material that is done with a zero embargo? We have
and sorry, Heather, just on that thought. And it's something that I think is often overlooked in discussions that Anne hit on it on the OSTP memo. There are the whole metadata and data requirements. And metadata is a topic that quite a lot of people find a little bit dull and boring, but it's quite vital, because if we're going towards a more repository-based road, that then raises the spectrum. You can have multiple versions of an article located all over the place in different repositories. How do we bring those together? How do we stop that proliferation happening? And that will get back to, I think, good metadata management and stewardship. So there's an element of kind of chaos we need to avoid as well as an unintended consequence.
But I would take that on the flip side, Dan. Actually, I would say if all of this content being published has better metadata, and it's machine readable. And really, what is the single biggest thing, in my opinion, that stops green from really becoming a viable route for someone to access research is discoverability and the fractured nature of green. It's all over the place. Who knows where it is? I can't find it. And or if machine readability and good metadata makes that content more discoverable, it's going to take about 20 minutes. Yeah, and I mean that to have the idea, not to actually execute it, but it's going to take a very short time before someone out there realizes if we can just give researchers an easy user interface to this content, we can actually start to make green a viable route. We can make these repository held copies a viable route, and we can argue AAM or VOR, and we can do that till the cows come home. The thing that stops people from using this content right now is they can't find it, and it's all over the place. So that, I just think that's really interesting, that there's a potential kind of, current under the OSTP that is taking into account this other route that could potentially, if implemented well, in time, not day one, offer an interesting opportunity for an aggregator.
Yeah, we've got some follow-on questions on in terms of green. Laura Bowering Mullen is asking Dan, is there still no evidence that publishers allowing self-archiving affects subscription revenue negatively? I don't think we're going so far as to say that, but we've talked about OA cannibalizing subs revenue, which I think we're already seeing. And I mean, it's hard to get a handle on the green and its potential impact. No?
Correct. It's hard to get a handle on it. I'm not sure there is evidence there. But it's too soon to tell. It gets us back to this conversation. All of a sudden, people start to make a lot of stuff green. Let's suppose people say, okay, to meet the OSTP memo requirements, we're going to push 30% of our papers out as author accepted manuscript into repositories. That's suddenly a much greater increase in that output. And then, as Anne said, if the discovery and search engines get better and the metadata gets better, we may then start to see that these kind of self-archiving routes do start to have an impact on revenues. I genuinely wouldn't want to call it either way at the moment, but at the moment I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that it's being undermined. And in actual fact, I think a lot of publishers, as part of their services, will archive manuscripts on authors' behalf into various repositories. I think that's been around for a while, affecting both subscription and open access models, whether it's in a hybrid journal or whatever.
Yep. Another question. This one's from David Brickner. Just to loop back to the comment that Deanne you made a few minutes back about funders paying and libraries paying. Do you think that possibility increases the likelihood of a kind of subvention model like the University of California Digital Library has in becoming more popular?
So subvention model,
where part is funder paid, part is library paid?
It's a good question. I suppose possibly.
It also depends on if we're keeping an APC model, but so in an APC environment.
And I think it's one of the interesting open questions that was raised by, there's a Congressional Oversight Committee that has raised some questions about this most recent OSTP memo, which is, where's the money going to come from? Could there be a possibility that the research money that should be going to research grants to actually do the research, some of that may get diverted to publication fees? I think there's a philosophical discussion, and I'm sure some people will say, well, that's a fair part of research, isn't it? Peer review is important. Others might say, well, actually, that should be a separate cost. It's publication charges. I would imagine, depending on where people's philosophy lands up, that might then drive whether we'll have a multi-funder or a multi-payer model or not. I'm going to go for a diplomatic, I really don't know on that one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that I'm hearing from library administrators is we all know the management of these agreements is a real bear. And kudos to University of California for setting up a system where they can administrate multi-payer. I think that throwing another thing to track into the workflow of some libraries might be just a little bit too much. I want to change path just a little bit. We have a question from Chris Erdman at AGU that we've been largely talking about the US here as an effect of the OSTP memo, but we live in this global system. And papers from China are making up a growing percentage of the articles that are in all of these journals. And how is China weighing OA in relation to what's happening in the US? And do we have any thoughts on the impact that that might have?
I'll go first, and then Heather, please come in. So, I mean, China seems to be going on a journey. Sort of 2 or 3 years ago, they came out with a centralized list of journals, and they seem to have a fairly negative view of open access. It was somehow lower quality, and certain entirely respectable journals were put on this prescribed list. My understanding is that has shifted. China's less, quote, hostile, if that's the right word, less sort of reluctant about open access. B, some of these journals will be taken off the list. But I think China's focus is moving more towards growing its own self-publishing program. And to do that, of course, they've got to increase the expertise and go on the publishing journey. So I think that there's likely to be a split between the two. And of course, who knows where they're going to land up, given the current head of the Communist Party, president of China. I don't know exactly what his job title is, but Xi has installed himself in life, and they seem to be becoming more insular and more nationalist. Of course, that might affect their policy as to will they continue to be as open with science as they appear to have been, or may things retrench a bit? So I think there's a sort of geopolitical factor in there as well. I mean, I'm interested to hear what other people's thoughts are on that.
So Dan, I think that I think China kind of deals with or should I say, a polarity or a tension. On the one hand, I believe they basically want to keep as much money as possible in China too. So APC funded open access, one could argue they may talk about quality and whatnot, but from what I've heard of folks on the ground, that the real thing is, and the polarity is, we want to keep this money in China. We want to be on our own. We want to have our own prestige titles, but we want the credibility and we want the prestige of publishing in, and I'm sorry to say it, some of the highest impact journals. And I hate to bring impact factor into it, but I do think that is part of the deciding factor. So, I don't think anybody in China is going to get angry with any scientist that gets published in Nature and Science and New England Journal of Medicine, or is that I don't think that's going to happen. So I think that's what it is. I think it's this kind of push me, pull you around. Let's grow our own capabilities. Let's keep our money within the walls. Let's increase what we can do here. But we also want a place on the world stage. And right now, a lot of the world stage is devoted to non-Chinese native journals. So we want to lift this up, but we also want to be recognized so that when our journals lift up and these authors published here, publish in China, we're lifting up our own perceived quality as well.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about obviously about STEM journals and the like. A lot of the folks who are on the call, but we have there are a lot of journals, and not just in humanities and social science, that are researcher-led journals that follow the Diamond model. There are certainly it's a big effort out there to kind of shake up how those different things move forward. And you mentioned that many regards scale favors the larger commercial publishers, but what role do you see for these new initiatives, or maybe sometimes not new initiatives but lesser visible researcher-led publications, to kind of maybe show a new way forward?
Well, we are way out of my area of expertise, but I will say the London School of Economics had an article this morning about cooperatives that it appeared to me to be basically geared toward these types of organizations. I can find the link. I don't have it now, but it looks like there are some initiatives to try and pool some of these resources together to support each other with peer review and costs and quality control, air quotes, however one wants to define that. I haven't dug into that article yet. I thought it was very interesting, but I am certainly no expert on researcher-led publications that are independent.
Dan, any thoughts on those models?
What she said.
And thank you, Robin. She put the link in the chat.
Yeah.
It was very interesting. I read it and I'm like, I have to go back to this. This sounds fascinating. And I really love the little color photo because it's about how agriculture had informed this model. And it's the person holding a bunch of little blueberries and everyone has a little open access lock on it. I thought that was creative.
Yeah. No, I think it's going to be a space to watch. I've presented in some sessions recently with Subscribe to Open Community of Practice. So I know that's a model that is also marching forward in a variety of different ways. And if those of you, joining us today have new models that you are exploring, make sure that you let us know so we can include those in the business model section of the Open Access Data and Analytics tool. Let's see, there's some more, there's chatter in the chat about China and impact factor and trends. If anyone has any good sources about China, please share them.
Also, Matt put in a very nice summary of the CDL model, Matt Wilmot.
Yeah.
Great. It takes a village to make one of these webinars. So I think we're getting close to time. And I want to just kind of loop back and just say, having been up to your eyebrows for the past few months, Dan, in this market sizing, what are you kind of maybe looking at, most closely? What are you listening for, kind of going forward?
I'd probably zoom out on that because you're right. It's very easy to get close to the numbers and the detail. But in general, obviously, we've got to remember that publishing is part of a much wider ecosystem. We are, if it's a bit of a negative description, but someone sort of framed it, it's a bit like doing your tax. If you're a researcher and you've got to submit a paper, it's kind of like doing your tax return at the end of the year. You're spending the bulk of your time doing your research, and then of course your paper is the kind of admin, the verification on top of that. So I think in that spirit, there's probably a couple of moving parts. Number one, just the macroeconomic outlook. I think in some ways, yeah, we can trend stuff out in charts and take a view on predictions. Who knows where we're going to be in a year's time? I don't want to end on a doom and gloom note, but I'm sure we're all very well aware of the challenges that are happening. And they're coming on multiple fronts. There's sort of economic stresses, there's historic low economic growth. I think all of that would have been a challenge regardless of what's happening with Vladimir Putin and so on. So I think those bigger factors could impact funding on research and development, and therefore on how much stuff is flowing into the academic system and in scholarly publishing. I just wouldn't like to call that at all. But personally, it kind of worries me. It seems a lot of things are coming together. And then the other thing that it just strikes me, I'd be interested on your guys' opinion on it as well, is we're moving to publishing ever more and more volume. And that then creates the challenge of where do we as publishers find the labor pool to peer review all that? Is there a danger we could be almost the victims of our own success because of the more stuff that needs to go out there, the more researchers and the more of researchers' time we might need to help us steward that stuff at a time when kind of researchers themselves, particularly in the US, are struggling to find the time and struggling to get onto the tenure track and all of that stuff. So I think there's a couple of big kind of macro issues that may start to have a bearing on what we see in terms of our humble market numbers.
Mm-hmm. Anne?
I have to tell you that I am feverishly, every time someone types, someone saving the chat. So we should definitely go through that and give folks that were on the webinar maybe some highlights, certainly the links. But anyway, so I think the thing that I think about the most, and forgive me if my adult brain, as I said, I'm going to go crash after this, is not up to par today. But I keep thinking about the OSTP, and I think someone up there it might have been Bill Trippy, was talking about, there's Plan S, there's OSTP, there are all these things that are happening. And I have been in a lot of rooms with a lot of publishers over many, many years. And sometimes there's this propensity to explain how everything that's happening isn't going to impact us, or it's not a big deal, or, well, we'll do this or that, or, we'll adjust this way or that way, or they didn't include this, so we don't have to worry about it. And I would challenge anyone having conversations like that to turn it around and say, what can you do right now? What can happen right now? And I'm not just talking about flipping your journals, but where are the places that you can innovate? Where are the places that you can try to find a legitimate value, even beyond peer review, that you're contributing to the environment? And how can you take that and potentially market that? Business and commercial, they're not bad words. It's not that they're evil. Everybody, it's just, to me, I feel as though it is the inability or the reluctance to change and adapt in a lot of cases that causes a lot of the problems that we have. So my point is, I would just like to leave everybody thinking, whether you're a publisher, whether you're a librarian, whether you're a funder, whether you're a researcher, whoever you are on this webinar, what's the thing that you, from your vantage point, can do to serve the ecosystem in a way that's so important that, quite frankly, it could actually be a business. It's so important, somebody would gladly pay you to resolve it. And I just hope more people start to think a little beyond what we've always done and how to incrementally tweak it and think about the next thing.
Yeah, and I want to end on maybe a more optimistic note. Some of our predictions we've done, including last year, we not only had the COVID bump, but we had a pretty large projected COVID dip. We thought, what about the research that won't get done because researchers won't be in their labs, that they won't be able to apply for? And it seems that researchers largely find a way. They figured out, staggered schedules. They figured out things they could do, outside the lab. Folks who are doing international collaborations have been back out there now, in the world. And so I think that, research, not to kind of be too kind of Jurassic Park, life finds a way, but researchers have found a way to make that work. And kudos for that. So that's going to be a wrap for our session today. I want to thank Dan and Anne and everyone who made this webinar and the recent news and views possible, including our survey participants. We would have a tough time without you. We'll be sharing a recorded version of this on our website in a few days, and you'll get an email notification of when that's available in case you want to listen again or share with colleagues. And if anything occurs to you that you want to talk to us about, don't hesitate to reach out or email us. Watch for our next discussion, probably in early 2023. And Lori Carlin, Meg White, and I will be in Charleston next week. So we hope we'll cross paths with you there or anywhere online. Stay healthy, stay well, everyone. Take care, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.